In the summer of 1853, a cartographer named Elias Drummond arrived at the offices of the United States Coast Survey in Washington, D.C., carrying a leather portfolio containing 6 hand-drawn maps and a 34-page written report that his supervisor had asked him to deliver in person. Drummond had spent 14 months in the field, in the river bottomlands of eastern Missouri, in the swamp-edged parishes of southern Louisiana, and along the overland routes through what official federal maps of the period labeled simply as Indian Country. He was 41 years old. He had been a government surveyor for 19 years and had worked in 8 states. He carried a surveying chain, a Brunton compass, and a field notebook that he had filled on 3 sides of every page because paper was expensive and his notes were thorough. He had never once filed an inaccurate measurement. His professional record shows no disputes, no appeals, no letters of complaint from any land office district in which he had worked. When he placed the portfolio on the desk of Assistant Superintendent Alexander Bakke, a man who oversaw the most prestigious scientific survey operation in the federal government, Bakke looked at the 6 maps for less than 4 minutes. Then he told Drummond to leave the portfolio, collect his travel expenses from the accounting office downstairs, and not discuss the contents of his report with anyone. He did not ask Drummond to sit down. He did not ask him a single question about 14 months of fieldwork. Drummond left. He went back to his rooming house on F Street. He sat at his writing table and spent the next 6 hours producing a duplicate of his 34-page report from memory, because he had written every word of it himself, and he remembered all of it. He mailed the duplicate that same evening to his brother-in-law, a merchant named Thomas Greer in Philadelphia, with a note that said, "Keep this, and do not open it until I write to you again." He never wrote again. He died of cholera in the summer of 1855. 23 months after delivering that portfolio. The duplicate report sat sealed in Thomas Greer's desk for 61 years, until it was found during a house clearance in 1916 and donated, along with a box of family letters, to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The finding aid entry was written in 1962. The report has been cited once in the published historical literature. That citation appeared in a footnote. The footnote did not describe the report's contents. Elias Drummond was not a political man. He was not a reformer. He was a professional who measured land for a living and recorded what he found. What his report described, the thing that made Alexander Bakke look at 6 maps for 4 minutes and close a portfolio, was a cartographic problem so large and so deliberately constructed that fixing it honestly would have required the federal government to acknowledge something it had spent 40 years arranging for no one to see. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research, unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to what Elias Drummond found in that portfolio. To understand what was wrong with the map of America in 1850, we have to understand what the map of America was for, not geographically. Legally, an American federal map in the mid-19th century was not primarily a navigational tool or a scientific record. It was a legal instrument. The boundaries drawn on federal survey maps determined land ownership, established treaty zones, defined the geographic limits of federal jurisdiction, and, most critically, determined which populations were considered to be inside the legal framework of the United States and which were considered to be outside it. A line on a federal map was not a description of the world. It was a decision about the world, about who existed, who owned what, and who could be dispossessed of what they held without the law noticing. Courts relied on them. Land speculators used them. Settlers followed them. Treaty negotiators referred to them. In a country that was simultaneously expanding its territory, absorbing new populations, and conducting a systematic transfer of land from communal and indigenous ownership into private hands, the map was one of the most powerful legal documents in existence. And by 1850, several of those lines had been drawn, moved, redrawn, and redrawn again in ways that the official published maps of the period did not reflect, and in at least 3 documented cases, could not have reflected, because the information needed to draw them accurately had been deliberately withheld from the cartographers doing the work. The map of America that most people were shown in school, the 1850 version, with its clean territorial boundaries and its orderly progression of states marching westward, was produced during a period that cartographic historians now recognize as one of the most systematically distorted in American mapping history. The distortions were not cartographic errors in the ordinary sense. They were not the product of imprecise instruments or limited access to the terrain. They were policy. 3 specific categories of information were routinely omitted, altered, or deliberately misrepresented on federal survey maps between 1830 and 1870. And the men responsible for producing those maps were not, in most cases, aware of what they were being asked to omit. Elias Drummond was one of the rare ones who found out. His report documented all 3 categories. That is what Alexander Bache put in a portfolio and closed in 4 minutes. The first category was the actual boundaries of Indian treaty territories. By 1850, the United States had entered into more than 250 separate treaties with native nations. Every one of those treaties established specific geographic boundaries that were legally binding under federal law and under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. They had been negotiated, signed, ratified by the Senate, and entered into the official record of federal law. They were not suggestions. They were not provisional. They were the law of the land, and the land they described was legally not available for settlement, purchase, or survey reallocation, regardless of what was happening on the ground. The official Federal Survey maps of the period did not accurately represent those boundaries. A study by cartographic historian Carl Wheat, building on a 40-year project to catalog every Federal Survey map produced between 1540 and 1880, identified what he called a systematic interior displacement in the representation of treaty boundaries on maps produced by the General Land Office between 1830 and 1865. The displacement consistently moved treaty boundary lines in the direction that expanded the zone legally available for white settlement. Not randomly, not in both directions. Consistently in one direction, inward, compressing the treaty territory, expanding the settleable zone adjacent to it. The average displacement Wheat measured across 34 treaty zones he examined in detail was 2 miles. In 11 of those 34 zones, the displacement exceeded 12 miles. In 2 of them, it exceeded 30. The General Land Office maps were the official government record. The treaty texts said one thing. The maps showed another. Settlers were following the maps. Courts were using the maps. The people whose land it legally was had no practical remedy in a legal system that treated the map as the authoritative document. The second category was the systematic erasure of free black settlements from the cartographic record. Between 1800 and 1860, several hundred organized free black communities existed in the United States, agricultural settlements, trading communities, and what historians now call freedom colonies, concentrated primarily in the Ohio Valley, in southern Indiana and Illinois, and the coastal regions of North Carolina and Virginia, and in the river parishes of Louisiana. These communities had property records, tax records, and in many cases, deeds registered with county clerks. They also had, in most cases, no representation on Federal Survey maps of the period. A 2003 study by geographer Andrew Carl, examining the cartographic record of 312 documented free black settlements in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois between 1820 and 1860, found that fewer than 8% appeared on contemporaneous federal survey maps. Despite having the tax and deed records that would normally require their inclusion in an accurate survey. Carl's study noted that this was not a question of the communities being too small or too transient to map. 12 of the settlements he examined had populations exceeding 200 people and had existed for more than a decade. None of them appeared on any federal survey map produced during their existence. Several were mapped for the first time only after they had been destroyed or dispersed. The cartographic record showed the land as empty. The land was not empty. The third category was the deliberate misrepresentation of physical geography in the territories that the federal government was actively trying to open for settlement. This is the category that Elias Drummond's 14-month field survey directly addressed, and it is the one that cost him his career in the span of a 4-minute conversation with a man who did not ask him a single question. The General Land Office was responsible for the township and range survey system that divided Western territories into the grid of sections that American land law still uses today. Township surveys were the legal basis for land patents. They were also the legal basis for determining which land was arable, which was swampland, and therefore subject to different ownership rules, and which was designated as part of a treaty zone. The classification mattered enormously, because the Swampland Acts of 1849 and 1850, passed in consecutive years with striking administrative efficiency, transferred swampland from federal ownership to state ownership, and from state ownership into the hands of private buyers at a small fraction of the price of arable land. If you wanted to acquire productive bottomland cheaply and legally, there was one straightforward mechanism available to you: have the land classified as swamp. And if you had access to the survey system or to the people who worked inside it, that was not a difficult thing to arrange. Drummond's fieldwork covered portions of 3 General Land Office survey districts in Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. What he found, and what his 34-page report documented in precise measurement, with field notebook entries, compass bearings, and elevation readings that he had taken himself, was that the filed township surveys for at least 27 sections in those 3 districts had recorded terrain characteristics that did not correspond to the actual terrain. Productive bottomland had been recorded as swamp. He had stood on it. He had measured it. He had documented the soil type, the drainage pattern, the presence of cultivation, and the elevation above the nearest watercourse. In 11 of the 27 sections, the discrepancy between the filed survey and the actual ground conditions was, in Drummond's professional assessment, too large to be an error. A surveyor does not accidentally record 600 acres of cultivated bottomland as swamp. He used the word deliberate exactly once in his report, in reference to the terrain misclassification in a section near the town of Boonville, Missouri, along the south bank of the Missouri River. He did not use it again. He was a careful man, and he knew what he was saying when he said it. He never used it again. He mailed his duplicate report to Philadelphia the same evening Bakke took the original. He died 19 months later. The terrain misclassification he documented in those 27 sections was never officially investigated. The 27 sections transferred out of federal ownership, into state hands, and then into private hands, at rates that Drummond himself had calculated in his report's final pages. He had done the arithmetic before he walked into Bakke's office. He had known what the numbers meant. The Congressional Globe, the predecessor to the Congressional Record, shows no debate, no inquiry, and no committee hearing related to General Land Office survey accuracy in the Missouri or Louisiana districts between 1853 and 1860. The General Land Office's own internal correspondence files for those years, held at the National Archives in Record Group 49, show a gap in routine district correspondence for the 3 districts Drummond surveyed that spans from August 1853 to March 1854, the 8 months following his visit to Bosch's office. The gap has no administrative explanation in the files. The files simply resume in March of 1854, as if the gap does not exist. The General Land Office has never explained what happened to the original Drummond portfolio after Baquet took it in July of 1853. It has never explained why the 3 Missouri and Louisiana survey districts Drummond examined show an 8-month correspondence gap in the months immediately following his visit to Washington. It has never explained why the 27 sections Drummond flagged as misclassified all changed hands within 4 years of his survey. In transactions the records show were handled by 3 land brokerage firms operating out of the same office building in St. Louis. Why do the Swampland Act transfer records for those 3 districts show a transfer rate of productive bottomland in the 18 months following Drummond's survey that was nearly 4 times the rate of the preceding 18 months? Why did Alexander Baquet, a man whose professional correspondence has been extensively studied by historians of 19th century American science, leave no surviving letter, no diary entry, and no administrative record of any kind referencing a visit by a surveyor named Elias Drummond in the summer of 1853? Why was the report that Drummond duplicated from memory and mailed to Philadelphia that same evening cited only once in the published historical literature, in a footnote that did not describe its contents? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But here is what makes Drummond's report different from every other account of 19th century survey fraud. In 1962, when the Historical Society of Pennsylvania processed the family papers and wrote the finding aid that listed the Drummond report, a staff archivist named Helen Carey read it in full as part of the cataloging process. She was doing her job. She read everything that came through her processing queue, made notes on each item, and filed those notes in the archivist's working file that accompanied the collection into permanent storage. Those working files are not part of the public finding aid. They are internal processing documents, and in most institutions they are discarded once the collection is cataloged. Helen Carey's notes were preserved because the Historical Society of Pennsylvania keeps archivist working files as a matter of institutional policy going back to its founding. It is one of the few archives in the country that does. Her notes on the Drummond report run to 6 pages. They summarize his findings in the 3 distortion categories with the precision of someone who had understood exactly what she was reading. At the bottom of the 6th page, she wrote a single sentence that was not a summary. It was an observation. The sentence read, "Nothing in this report has ever appeared in print." Those notes sat alongside the Drummond report for 49 years until a researcher named Paul Osterhagen, a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh working on a dissertation about 19th century land fraud in the Ohio Valley, came across the Drummond name in a file box adjacent to some unrelated Pennsylvania Railroad records in 2011. He filed an access request. He read the report and Carey's notes together. He cited both in his 2013 dissertation, which was accepted by the university, placed in the library's holdings, and has never been published as a book or in a peer-reviewed journal. Osterhagen now teaches high school history in western Pennsylvania. He completed no further academic research on this topic. Helen Carey retired from the Historical Society in 1979. She died in 1994. The 6 pages of notes are still in the working file. The map of 1850 that you were shown in school was not an accurate representation of the country. It was a legal and administrative document produced by an institution with specific interests in how the land was classified, who could own it, and which communities would appear on the record as having existed there. The three categories of distortion that Drummond documented: treaty boundary displacement, the erasure of free black settlements, and deliberate terrain misclassification, were not the work of isolated bad actors making individual decisions in the dark. Carl Wheat's study covered 34 treaty zones across 35 years of mapping. Andrew Carl's covered 312 settlements across 3 states. Drummond's covered 27 sections in 3 districts in a single 14-month field survey, and he found deliberate misclassification in all 3 of them. The pattern was institutional. The map was the instrument. What the map showed, the law enforced. What the map did not show, the law could not protect. You were taught that the map was a picture of the country. What the evidence tells us is that the map was a set of decisions about who the country was for, and those decisions were made by men who understood exactly what a line on a surveyor's page was worth, and who made sure that the lines fell where they needed them to fall. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the General Land Office survey system directly to a private land speculation company that operated out of Washington, D.C. between 1847 and 1868. The company had no public name. Its transactions were recorded under a series of numbered ledger accounts at a bank in Alexandria, Virginia. 3 of its principal investors held positions inside the federal government at the time of those investments. The bank's ledgers were donated to the Library of Virginia in 1931. They have never been digitized. You will not want to miss it.